Hello everyone, I am the Boring Historian and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. In the dim glow of rushlights and crackling hearths across the cobbled streets and muddy byways of medieval Europe, a timeless human pursuit flourished with remarkable vigor. The quest for intoxication. From the humblest peasant quaffing ale in a roadside alehouse to nobles sipping imported wines in castle halls, the medieval world was awash in alcohol, its consumption woven into the very fabric of daily life. This is not merely a tale of merrymaking, though there was plenty to be found. It is a journey through social customs, survival strategies, religious rituals, and the universal human desire to occasionally escape the harsh realities of a world where life was often, as Thomas Hobbes would later describe it, nasty, brutish, and short. Contrary to popular belief, medieval people did not drink alcohol solely to avoid contaminated water. Clean water was available from springs and wells in many areas and was certainly consumed. However, alcoholic beverages, particularly ale and beer, were dietary staples that transcended mere thirst quenching. They were food, medicine, social currency, and cultural cornerstone rolled into one frothy cup. Liquid bread was no mere nickname for ale, but a nutritional reality. In a world before modern preservation techniques, where crop failures could spell starvation, the caloric value of fermented grain beverages provided critical sustenance. A medieval laborer might consume a gallon or more of ale daily, fueling the backbreaking work of agricultural life. For monastic communities, brewing was both practical necessity and spiritual discipline. Benedict's rule, which guided monastic life throughout much of medieval Europe, prescribed a hemina, about half a liter, of wine daily for each monk. This allowance acknowledged both the nutritional value and the modest pleasure derived from alcoholic beverages, while emphasizing moderation. God made ale, went a common English saying, the devil made taverns. A sentiment that captured the medieval understanding that alcohol itself was a divine gift, while excessive consumption and the environments that encouraged it remained problematic. Medieval drinking culture reflected the rigid social stratification of the era. What one drank spoke volumes about one's place in society, with different beverages carrying distinct associations of class, wealth, and prestige. At the bottom of the social ladder, ale reigned supreme. Home-brewed by the Brewsters, female brewers of England and Northern Europe, ale was thick, nutritious, and quick to spoil, typically consumed within days of production. Without hops as a preservative, medieval ale required frequent brewing, making it a constant household task in many homes. Its cloudy appearance and sweet, malty taste would be largely unrecognizable to modern beer drinkers. For the nobility and wealthy merchants, wine represented the pinnacle of sophisticated drinking. Imported from southern regions at considerable expense, wine was the beverage of choice for those who could afford it. Red wine from France and sweet fortified varieties from Mediterranean regions were particularly prized. The medieval wine trade represented one of the era's most significant commercial enterprises, with ships and wagon trains transporting precious barrels across the continent. Between these extremes lay a spectrum of beverages catering to various social ranks. Cider and perry, made from pears, provided fruit-based alternatives in regions where apples and pears grew abundantly. Mead, fermented honey water sometimes flavored with herbs or spices, carried connections to ancient traditions and was often reserved for special occasions. By the later medieval period, hopped beer began to challenge ale's dominance, particularly in regions with German influence. The addition of hops extended shelf life significantly, and created a more bitter flavor profile. This innovation would eventually transform European brewing practices, though traditional ale maintained its cultural foothold in many areas well into the Renaissance. The production of alcoholic beverages in medieval times was a blend of practical science, folk wisdom, and occasional superstition. Brewing ale was primarily women's work, a domestic skill passed from mother to daughter alongside other household crafts. These alewives or brewsters produced small batches for family consumption, selling excess production to neighbors or at local markets. To signal the availability of fresh ale, households would place an ale stake, often a pole with a bush or garland attached, outside their door, an early form of commercial advertising. As demand grew, some women became professional brewers, expanding their operations beyond household production. The brewing process itself was relatively straightforward but labor-intensive. Malted barley was mixed with hot water in large wooden vats to create a sweet liquid called wort. After straining, the wort was fermented with yeast, often simply the residue from previous batches, and sometimes flavored with a mixture of herbs and spices called gruit before hops became common. Wine production remained more specialized and geographically limited. Vineyards flourished in southern regions with suitable climates, while northern areas relied on imports. Monastic communities played a crucial role in developing viticulture techniques, with certain orders becoming renowned for their winemaking expertise. The distillation of spirits, though known in the medieval period, remained primarily in the realm of alchemy and medicine, rather than everyday consumption. Distilled alcoholic beverages like aqua vitae, the precursor to whiskey and brandy, were considered medicinal elixirs rather than recreational drinks. The social geography of medieval drinking was defined by distinct types of establishments, each serving different clientele and purposes. Alehouses represented the most common and humble drinking venues, often simply the front room of a private home where an enterprising housewife sold her excess brew. These establishments catered primarily to the working classes, offering simple ale and perhaps basic food in an informal setting. The alehouse provided a rare third space beyond home and work, where common folk could gather, socialize, and momentarily escape the hardships of daily life. Taverns occupied a middle ground in the drinking hierarchy. More formal than alehouses, but less grand than inns, taverns specialized in selling wine rather than ale. This focus on wine attracted a somewhat more affluent clientele, including merchants, craftsmen, and minor officials. Taverns often featured multiple rooms, permanent seating, and a wider selection of food and drink options. Inns represented the most comprehensive hospitality establishments, offering not just drinks but also meals, lodging, and stabling for horses. Catering primarily to travelers, inns played a crucial role in the medieval transportation network. Located along major roads and near city gates, they provided essential services for merchants, pilgrims, and others journeying across the medieval landscape. The physical environment of these establishments varied widely. A rural alehouse might be indistinguishable from an ordinary cottage, while urban taverns and inns could be substantial structures with multiple stories and specialized spaces. Common features included a main room with a central hearth, trestle tables and benches for communal seating, and a bar, literally a barrier separating customers from the stored beverages and serving area. Medieval drinking culture encompassed elaborate social rituals that reinforced community bonds and established hierarchies. Toasting, raising cups together before drinking, had ancient roots and carried quasi-religious significance. The shared cup, passed from person to person during special occasions, symbolized unity and trust among participants. Gaming accompanied drinking in many settings, despite frequent prohibitions from authorities. Dice, backgammon, and various card games provided entertainment and opportunities for gambling. These games occasionally erupted into disputes, contributing to the rowdy reputation of drinking establishments. Music and storytelling transformed drinking spaces into informal performance venues. Wandering minstrels, local musicians, and talented patrons entertained crowds with songs, tales, and recitations. These performances preserved oral traditions, spread news and gossip, and created memorable shared experiences that strengthened community identity. Drinking vessels themselves carried significant cultural meaning. Wooden cups and leather jacks served most common drinkers, while pewter, silver, and even gold vessels signified wealth and status. Special ceremonial drinking horns and elaborate goblets featured in ritual occasions across all social classes, from peasant weddings to royal feasts. The social ecosystem of medieval drinking establishments featured a colorful cast of characters, each playing defined roles in the theater of intoxication. Publicans and alewives managed these establishments with varying degrees of professionalism. Some were respected community figures who maintained orderly houses and engaged in civic affairs. Others operated on the margins of respectability, with their establishments serving as fronts for prostitution, fencing stolen goods, or other illicit activities. Geoffrey Chaucer's Harry Bailey, the innkeeper in the Canterbury Tales, exemplifies the idealized tavern host, confident, articulate, and capable of managing diverse clientele with diplomatic skill. His fictional counterpart suggests the real-life importance of such figures as community leaders and social connectors. The clientele of drinking establishments crossed social boundaries, though certain venues catered to specific demographics. Urban taverns might serve a mix of local craftsmen, merchants, clerics, and students, creating unexpected social interactions across class lines. Rural alehouses primarily served local agricultural workers and travelers passing through the area. Women's participation in drinking culture was complex and contradictory. While women dominated the production of ale as brewsters, their presence as customers in public drinking establishments often faced social constraints. Respectable women might attend with husbands or family groups, while unaccompanied women in taverns risked damage to their reputations. Medieval authorities maintained an ambivalent relationship with drinking establishments, recognizing both their economic importance and their potential for social disruption. Taxation of alcohol production and sales provided significant revenue for both local and royal governments, creating a financial incentive to tolerate and regulate rather than prohibit. Alehouses, taverns, and inns required licenses in many jurisdictions, with local officials conducting regular ale tastings to ensure quality standards were maintained. These inspections served dual purposes: protecting consumers from inferior products while generating income through fines for violations. Drinking establishments frequently became sites of political discussion and organization. Away from the direct oversight of authorities, commoners could speak more freely about grievances and share information. Several peasant revolts and urban uprisings of the medieval period were planned or gained momentum in tavern settings, leading authorities to view these spaces with suspicion. Church authorities similarly expressed concern about excessive drinking while participating in the culture themselves. Monastic orders produced some of the finest alcoholic beverages of the era, yet ecclesiastical courts regularly punished individuals for drunkenness and operating illegal alehouses. This contradiction reflected the Church's broader struggle to reconcile everyday practices with spiritual ideals. Shared drinking rituals reinforced group identity across medieval society. guild members cemented professional bonds through formal feasts and drinking ceremonies. Village communities marked agricultural seasons and life events, with collective celebration involving generous alcohol consumption. The guild cup, passed among members during meetings, symbolized the shared prosperity and mutual support at the heart of these professional organizations. Similarly, village ale festivals, known as church ales, when organized to raise funds for the parish, strengthened local solidarity through communal brewing, feasting, and drinking. Drinking practices also reinforced boundaries between groups. Religious minorities maintained distinct traditions. Jewish communities produced kosher wine according to their own regulations, while Muslim populations in medieval Spain and Sicily generally abstained from alcohol in accordance with Islamic teaching, though with notable exceptions among elites. Regional identities expressed themselves through distinctive drinking customs and local specialties. The wines of particular valleys, the unique ale recipes of specific towns, and the special ceremonial drinks associated with local festivals all contributed to a sense of place and belonging. The negative consequences of excessive alcohol consumption were well recognized in medieval society. Medical texts described the physical effects of drunkenness in detail, often attributing them to humoral imbalances according to prevailing medical theories. Moral and religious writings condemned drunkenness as a gateway to other sins, particularly violence, lust, and sloth. Violence frequently accompanied heavy drinking, with court records documenting countless tavern brawls that escalated from verbal insults to serious injury or death. Weapons were commonly carried in medieval society, making intoxicated disputes particularly dangerous. Local ordinances often required innkeepers to confiscate weapons from patrons to reduce this risk. Sexual exploitation represented another dark aspect of drinking culture. Certain establishments functioned as informal brothels, with female servers expected to provide sexual services alongside drinks. The association between alcohol and sexual availability created dangerous environments for women working in or near drinking establishments. Economic hardship resulted from excessive drinking for many families. Court records and church documents reveal cases of men drinking away household resources while their families went hungry. Parish relief sometimes stepped in to support such families, creating early forms of social welfare intervention. The medieval relationship between religion and alcohol was intricate and sometimes contradictory. At the center of Christian worship stood the Eucharist, with wine literally or symbolically transformed into the blood of Christ. This sacred use of alcohol established a theological foundation for understanding wine as potentially sacred rather than inherently sinful. Religious festivals incorporated drinking as part of their celebration. Saints' days, Christmas, Easter, and local patronal festivals featured alcohol consumption as an integral component of communal joy. Church authorities generally tolerated these celebrations while attempting to moderate their excesses. Monastic communities maintained complex relationships with alcohol. While many orders produced exceptional wines and ales, their internal regulations carefully controlled consumption. The Benedictine allowance of daily wine acknowledged human need for modest pleasure, while warning against excess. Other orders imposed stricter limitations, particularly during periods of fasting and penance. Pilgrimage created special contexts for drinking, as travelers relied on roadside inns and monastery guest houses for sustenance. The journey to holy sites like Canterbury, Santiago de Compostela, or Jerusalem involved not just spiritual devotion, but also participation in the drinking cultures of the regions traversed. Medieval festival culture created sanctioned periods of excess and role reversal, with alcohol serving as a crucial lubricant for these temporary inversions of the social order. Carnival celebrations before Lent, midsummer festivities, and harvest festivals all featured heightened alcohol consumption as communities temporarily suspended ordinary constraints. The Lord of Misrule, or King of Fools traditions, popular across medieval Europe, installed temporary mock rulers who presided over periods of festivity. These figures often issued comical commands, requiring participants to drink, with penalties for those who failed to comply. Such ritualized drinking games provided psychological release from the rigid hierarchies of everyday medieval life. Charivari and other forms of community justice often incorporated public drinking as part of their ritual humiliation of wrongdoers. Individuals who violated community norms might be paraded through town on a cart, subjected to mockery, and forced to provide drinks for their tormentors as penance for their social transgressions. The temporary nature of these festivities was crucial to their social function. By allowing controlled periods of excess, medieval society created safety valves for releasing tensions, while ultimately reinforcing the existing order. The return to sobriety and normal hierarchies following these festivals reaffirmed, rather than undermined, the established structure. At the highest levels of medieval society, drinking rituals displayed extraordinary opulence, while serving crucial political functions. Royal feasts featured elaborate ceremonial cups, often made of precious metals and adorned with jewels. The act of drinking from these vessels was highly ritualized, with specific courtiers assigned the honor of serving the monarch. The loving cup tradition, where a special vessel passed among banquet participants, symbolized trust and unity among potentially rival nobles. Drinking from the same cup created bonds of shared experience and mutual obligation that helped stabilize volatile political relationships. Diplomatic exchanges frequently centered around shared drinking. Receiving foreign emissaries typically involved ceremonial toasts and gift exchanges of prized beverages from the visitor's homeland. The ability to maintain composure while participating in these drinking rituals was considered an essential skill for diplomats and courtiers. Wine cellars became important symbols of royal power, with monarchs employing specialized staff to procure the finest vintages. Royal households consumed vast quantities of alcohol. Records from medieval England suggest daily wine allowances of a gallon or more for high-ranking nobles at court, with proportionally smaller amounts for those of lower status. Medieval medical theory, based primarily on ancient Greek and Arabic sources, interpreted alcohol's effects through the lens of the humoral system. According to this framework, different beverages possessed inherent qualities of heat, cold, moisture, and dryness that interacted with the body's natural humoral balance. Wine, particularly red wine, was considered hot and dry in nature, making it beneficial for counteracting conditions associated with excessive cold and moisture. Physicians commonly prescribed moderate wine consumption for melancholic individuals believed to suffer from an excess of cold, dry black bile, and for the elderly, whose natural heat was thought to diminish with age. Ale and beer were generally classified as colder and more moist than wine, making them suitable for different constitutions and conditions. These beverages were often recommended for those with hot temperaments or ailments, including certain fevers and inflammatory conditions. Medieval medical texts described in detail the progression of intoxication, from initial relaxation through impaired judgment to complete incapacitation. These descriptions recognized the biphasic nature of alcohol's effects, stimulating at lower doses while sedating at higher levels, though explaining these effects through humoral rather than neurochemical mechanisms. Distilled spirits, known collectively as aqua vitae, water of life, represented the intersection of alchemy and medicine in medieval practice. These powerful alcoholic preparations were primarily used as solvents for extracting and preserving medicinal compounds from herbs, minerals, and animal products. Herbal wines and ales served as common vehicles for administering medicinal substances. Infusing alcoholic beverages with herbs, roots, and other ingredients created preparations that combined the perceived benefits of alcohol itself with the specific properties of the added substances. These medicated drinks treated ailments ranging from digestive complaints to reproductive issues. Spiced or mulled wine, heated with combinations of cinnamon, ginger, pepper, and other exotic spices, was particularly recommended during cold weather and outbreaks of plague. The warming properties of both the alcohol and the spices were believed to fortify the body against disease-causing miasmas. Alcohol's preservation properties made it invaluable for creating stable medicinal preparations in an era before synthetic drugs. Tinctures, extracts, and elixirs relied on alcohol's ability to prevent spoilage while extracting active compounds from plant and animal materials. Medieval observers recognized alcohol's potential for both acute harm and chronic damage, though explaining these effects through frameworks is very different from modern medicine. Excessive drunkenness was understood as a dangerous imbalance of the body's natural systems, potentially leading to both immediate risks and long-term deterioration. Theologians and moral philosophers classified drunkenness among the deadly sins, particularly as a form of gluttony. Thomas Aquinas and other scholastic thinkers distinguished between moderate enjoyment of alcohol, morally acceptable, and excessive consumption that impaired reason, sinful. This moral framework complemented medical understandings of alcohol's harms. Public health concerns about alcohol appeared in various civic regulations. Towns and cities throughout medieval Europe enacted ordinances controlling the hours of operation for drinking establishments, limiting the strength of beverages sold, and imposing penalties for public drunkenness. These measures reflected recognition of alcohol's role in public disorder and injury. The concept of addiction, though not formulated in modern terms, appears in medieval descriptions of habitual drunkards. Medical and religious texts describe individuals unable to moderate their consumption, despite obvious negative consequences, a pattern recognized as pathological even without modern neurobiological explanations. While European drinking culture centered around ale, beer, and wine, the broader medieval world featured diverse traditions of intoxication. Islamic regions maintained complex relationships with alcohol, officially prohibited but sometimes tolerated among elites, particularly in Persian and Ottoman court culture, where poets celebrated wine in elaborate metaphorical verse. East Asian drinking traditions focused on rice wine, sake in Japan, and various grain-based fermented beverages. Chinese medical texts, like their European counterparts, attributed both beneficial and harmful properties to alcohol depending on the individual's constitution and the circumstances of consumption. Mead remained important throughout Northern Europe and in regions with Slavic influence, where honey production flourished. Special varieties incorporating herbs, berries, and spices marked ceremonial occasions and seasonal celebrations throughout these regions. Indigenous American traditions, though technically outside the European medieval period, developed their own fermented beverages during this same historical era. Pulque in Mesoamerica and chicha in Andean regions served ritual and social functions comparable to those of alcohol in European societies. Medieval travel accounts frequently commented on the drinking practices encountered in foreign lands. Pilgrims, merchants, and diplomats expressed fascination, admiration, or horror at unfamiliar beverages and drinking customs, often using these observations to reinforce cultural boundaries. Marco Polo's accounts of Asia included detailed descriptions of kumis, fermented mare's milk, among Mongol peoples, and various rice wines in China. These beverages seemed exotic to European readers, yet Polo noted similarities in social functions across these different drinking traditions. Jewish travelers navigated complex religious requirements regarding kosher wine while journeying through diverse regions. Their accounts reveal strategies for maintaining religious observance while participating in the social necessity of shared drinking in various cultural contexts. The Crusades created particularly intense cross-cultural drinking encounters, as European Christians encountered Islamic prohibitions alongside Eastern Christian and Jewish traditions. These interactions sometimes led to adoption of new beverages and drinking practices that travelers brought back to their homelands. The Byzantine Empire maintained elaborate drinking traditions, descended from ancient Roman practices, but influenced by Eastern Orthodox Christianity. Wine featured prominently in both religious and secular contexts, with specialized glassware and serving rituals marking social distinctions among the Byzantine elite. Islamic scholarly and medical traditions contributed significantly to understanding alcohol's effects, despite religious prohibitions. Works by physicians like Ibn Sina, Avicenna, included detailed analyses of alcohol's properties and effects on different body systems, influencing both Islamic and European medical approaches. Eastern Christian communities developed distinctive liturgical uses of wine that differed from Western practice. Armenian, Coptic, and various Orthodox traditions incorporated wine into religious ceremonies with their own theological interpretations and ritual details. Trade routes connecting East and West facilitated exchange of both beverages and drinking practices. Distillation techniques, originally developed for perfumes and medicines, spread along these routes, eventually transforming drinking cultures throughout the medieval world. Medieval literature abounds with depictions of drinking and drunkenness, from celebratory to cautionary. The Old English epic Beowulf features elaborate mead hall scenes, where drinking rituals cement bonds between lords and warriors. The shared cup becomes a symbol of loyalty and mutual obligation, central to Anglo-Saxon heroic culture. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales presents a cross-section of medieval drinking culture through diverse characters and settings. The miller, perpetually drunk in body, contrasts with the refined Franklin, who appreciates fine wines as part of his cultivated lifestyle. The Tabard Inn itself, where the pilgrims gather, exemplifies the important social function of drinking establishments. Drinking songs and tavern poetry flourished as popular genres throughout the period. These works range from simple rhythmic verses designed for group participation to sophisticated Latin poems by clerical authors, celebrating wine's pleasures while acknowledging its dangers. Religious literature incorporated both positive and negative depictions of alcohol. While cautionary tales warned against excess, other traditions used wine as a metaphor for divine love and spiritual intoxication. This ambivalence reflected broader cultural attitudes toward alcohol's dual potential. Visual representations of drinking appear throughout medieval art, serving narrative, symbolic, and decorative functions. Manuscript illuminations frequently depict feast scenes, with detailed renderings of drinking vessels, serving practices, and occasionally the effects of overindulgence. Religious art incorporated wine imagery in multiple contexts. Beyond the obvious Eucharistic references, biblical scenes like the wedding at Cana and Noah's drunkenness appeared in church decoration, presenting complex moral messages about alcohol's proper and improper uses. Drinking vessels themselves became canvases for artistic expression. Decorated tankards, goblets, and cups featured intricate designs ranging from simple geometric patterns to elaborate narrative scenes. These functional objects blurred the boundary between utilitarian craft and fine art. Tavern signs and trade symbols created a visual language associated with drinking establishments. With limited literacy, these visual markers help potential customers identify not just the presence of a drinking establishment, but often its specific character and offerings. Drinking songs constituted a major genre of medieval popular music, with examples preserved in manuscripts from throughout Europe. These songs featured catchy melodies, simple rhyme schemes, and often call and response structures that facilitated group participation. Performances in taverns and alehouses ranged from spontaneous singing to more organized entertainment by professional or semi-professional musicians. These performers adapted their repertoire to suit the setting and audience, from bawdy songs in common establishments to more refined music in venues serving wealthier clientele. Musical instruments associated with drinking contexts included portable options like pipes, small drums, fiddles, and harps. Larger establishments in urban areas might feature more elaborate musical ensembles for special occasions. Dancing frequently accompanied drinking and music, despite periodic attempts by authorities to restrict such activities. Circle and line dances suited to crowded tavern spaces allowed communal participation, while more complex choreographed dances might feature at elite drinking events. The later medieval period witnessed significant transformations in drinking culture that would shape subsequent centuries. The widespread adoption of hops in beer production, gradually spreading from Germanic regions throughout Europe, created more stable, longer-lasting beverages that could support larger-scale commercial production and distribution. Distillation techniques moved increasingly from medical to recreational applications. By the 15th century, spirits like brandy, distilled wine, began to appear as beverages in their own right, rather than purely as medical preparations. This development would eventually revolutionize drinking cultures worldwide. Regional specialization intensified as transportation networks improved and commercial production increased. Certain areas became renowned for particular beverages, the wines of specific French regions, distinctive beer styles from Flemish cities, and specialized spirits from various locales developed loyal followings beyond their places of origin. Guild structures formalized the production of alcoholic beverages in urban areas. Brewers' guilds, vintners' associations, and similar organizations established quality standards, regulated prices, and controlled entry into these trades. These institutional developments created more consistent products, while sometimes stifling innovation. The transition from medieval to early modern drinking cultures involved both continuity and significant change. Traditional drinking establishments evolved to serve changing social needs, with some alehouses developing into more formal public houses or pubs, while taverns either adapted to new expectations or declined in importance. Colonial expansion introduced European drinking practices to new regions, while bringing unfamiliar beverages back to Europe. This exchange transformed drinking cultures on multiple continents, creating hybrid traditions that combined elements from diverse sources. The Protestant Reformation challenged aspects of traditional drinking culture, particularly those associated with Catholic religious festivals and monastic production. In some regions, especially those influenced by Calvinism, attitudes toward alcohol became more restrictive, while other areas maintained more continuity with medieval practices. Scientific understanding gradually replaced humoral theories of alcohol's effects, though this transition occurred unevenly across regions and social classes. By the late Renaissance, More systematic observations of alcohol's physiological impacts began to influence both medical advice and popular understanding. Medieval drinking traditions continue to influence contemporary culture in numerous ways. Modern beer styles like Belgian Abbey ales and German wheat beers trace their lineage directly to medieval brewing traditions, maintained through centuries of careful preservation and adaptation. Renaissance fairs, medieval-themed restaurants, and historical reenactments attempt to recreate aspects of medieval drinking culture for modern participants. While often romanticized and simplified, these interpretations keep certain traditions alive in the popular imagination. Historical breweries and wineries emphasize their medieval origins as marketing strategies, connecting contemporary consumers to imagined historical continuities. Brands featuring monks, castle imagery, or references to guild traditions tap into associations between age and quality. Academic interest in medieval drinking cultures has grown significantly in recent decades, with historians, archaeologists, and food scientists collaborating to reconstruct historical beverages and drinking practices. Experimental archaeology has successfully recreated medieval ales, meads, and wines using period-appropriate ingredients and techniques. The story of medieval intoxication reveals both the historical particularity of specific drinking traditions and the universal human elements that transcend time and place. The fundamental human desires that drove medieval people to their cups, seeking pleasure, building community, escaping hardship, marking special occasions, and exploring altered states of consciousness, remain recognizable in our own relationship with alcohol. The medieval drinker might find our modern beverages strange in flavor and our drinking establishments unfamiliar in form, but they would immediately recognize the social functions these serve. The shared toast celebrating a milestone, the consoling drink after a loss, the festive cup marking a holiday. These experiences connect us across the centuries to our medieval predecessors. Perhaps most significantly, medieval drinking culture reminds us that intoxication has never been a simple matter of physiology, but always a complex intersection of biology, psychology, social structure, economic factors, and cultural meaning. The medieval tavern, like the modern bar, was never merely a place to consume alcohol, but a space where communities defined themselves, where social bonds were strengthened or broken, where traditions were enacted and transformed. In studying how medieval people got drunk, we ultimately learn about how they lived, worked, worshipped, celebrated, suffered, and made meaning in their world. Lessons that continue to illuminate our understanding of both past and present. The medieval city created distinctive drinking environments shaped by dense populations, diverse social groups, and complex regulatory structures. Urban taverns operated under closer scrutiny than their rural counterparts, with city authorities imposing curfews, quality controls, and behavioral restrictions that reflected concerns about public order. London's taverns and alehouses numbered in the hundreds by the late medieval period, clustering along major thoroughfares and near commercial centers like markets and wharves. The city's Liber Albus, White Book, from the early 15th century, detailed extensive regulations governing these establishments, mandating standard measures, setting maximum prices, and prohibiting service to apprentices or after curfew. Paris developed a particularly sophisticated urban drinking culture, with establishments ranging from humble cabarets serving the working poor to elegant taverns catering to university students and professionals. The Latin Quarter, home to the University of Paris, became notorious for its student drinking culture, with taverns serving as informal extensions of academic life, where philosophical debates continued over cups of wine. Italian cities like Florence and Venice featured wine shops, osterias, where patrons could sample local and imported vintages, often accompanied by simple foods. These establishments functioned as important social hubs where business deals were negotiated, political alliances formed, and community news exchanged over shared carafes of wine. The urban tavern's architecture evolved to accommodate multiple functions and clientele. Larger establishments featured separate rooms for different social groups or activities, private dining chambers for wealthy patrons, common rooms for general customers, and sometimes specialized spaces for gambling or entertainment. This physical stratification reflected and reinforced social hierarchies within the shared drinking environment. Rural drinking establishments served different functions from their urban counterparts, operating as essential community centers in sparsely populated areas. The village alehouse might serve as impromptu courthouse, marketplace, hiring hall, and information exchange, functions that in towns would be distributed across specialized venues. Agricultural rhythms dictated rural drinking patterns, with consumption increasing during harvest celebrations and winter festivals when work demands eased. Plowing competitions, sheep shearing, and other communal work events typically concluded with shared drinking that reaffirmed community bonds forged through collective labor. Roadside inns connected isolated rural communities to broader networks of commerce and information. Strategically located along trade routes, these establishments served travelers while providing local residents access to news, goods, and connections from beyond their immediate vicinity. For many villagers, the local inn provided their primary contact with the world beyond their parish boundaries. Home brewing remained more common in rural areas throughout the medieval period, with many households producing their own ale for daily consumption. This domestic production created informal exchange networks as neighbors shared batches and techniques, strengthening community interdependence. Rural drinking spaces often blurred the boundaries between public and private, commercial and domestic. Brewing and drinking frequently occurred in multi-purpose spaces that served other household and community functions, reflecting the less specialized nature of rural life compared to urban environments. Monastery walls contained some of medieval Europe's most sophisticated brewing and winemaking operations. Religious orders like the Benedictines and Cistercians developed specialized knowledge that elevated beverage production from household craft to systematic enterprise, creating products renowned for their quality and consistency. The physical layout of monastic brewing facilities reflected this systematic approach, with dedicated spaces for each production stage. Archaeological excavations at sites like Fountains Abbey in England reveal elaborate brew houses with stone tanks, drainage systems, and specialized storage areas far more sophisticated than typical household brewing arrangements. Monastic hospitality rules required providing appropriate refreshment to travelers and pilgrims, making breweries and wine cellars essential components of these religious communities. The rule of Saint Benedict specifically addressed the provision of food and drink to guests, recognizing hospitality as a sacred duty that included offering suitable beverages. The symbolic and liturgical importance of wine created special requirements for its production and storage within religious contexts. Sacramental wine needed to meet specific criteria regarding ingredients and handling, with dedicated vineyard plots and storage vessels reserved for this purpose in many monastic communities. Beyond their walls, monasteries influenced broader drinking cultures through technological innovation, quality standards, and moral guidance. Techniques developed within monastic breweries and vineyards gradually spread to secular production, while monastic writings on moderation shaped cultural attitudes toward appropriate consumption. The objects from which medieval people drank were never merely utilitarian, but carried rich social and symbolic significance. Material, form, decoration, and context all communicated messages about status, occasion, and the nature of what was being consumed. Wooden vessels served most ordinary drinkers for everyday consumption. Turned cups, carved mazers, broad, shallow drinking bowls, often with metal rims, and stave-built tankards provided durable, relatively inexpensive options for household and tavern use. Archaeological finds reveal remarkable preservation of these organic vessels in waterlogged conditions, offering glimpses of common drinking practices. Pottery drinking vessels ranged from crude earthenware cups to sophisticated glazed ceramics. Regional pottery traditions developed distinctive drinking vessel forms, like the tall, cylindrical stoneware tankards of the Rhineland, or the globular earthenware jugs, common in England. These ceramic vessels often featured decorative elements, applied medallions, incised patterns, or colored glazes that enhanced their visual appeal. Horn cups, fashioned from cattle or sheep horns mounted with metal rims, connected drinkers to ancient traditions. These vessels featured prominently in ceremonial drinking, particularly in regions with Norse influence. The irregular natural form of the horn created distinctive drinking rituals, as horns could not be set down until emptied. Glass drinking vessels, though relatively rare and expensive through most of the medieval period, grew increasingly common in the later Middle Ages, particularly in Mediterranean regions and wealthy households. Venetian glass blowers produced increasingly delicate and elaborate drinking cups that became prized luxury items across Europe. Metal drinking vessels signified wealth and status, with materials ranging from pewter for prosperous commoners to silver and gold for the elite. These precious metal cups often featured elaborate decoration, engraving, relief work, enameling, and gem settings that displayed the owner's wealth and artistic patronage as much as they served practical drinking functions. Storage and transportation containers shaped medieval drinking practices as significantly as the vessels from which beverages were directly consumed. The wooden barrel or cask represented the fundamental technology enabling the commercial alcohol trade, allowing production and consumption to occur in different locations. Coopers, barrel makers, practiced a highly specialized craft essential to medieval beverage production. Their technical knowledge, selecting appropriate woods, shaping staves to precise curvatures, creating watertight seals without modern adhesives, represented crucial expertise that directly affected beverage quality and transportability. Barrel sizing became standardized in many regions, creating units of measure that facilitated commerce. The English system included hogsheads, butts, tons, and other specified volumes that allowed buyers and sellers to trade precisely defined quantities, often without seeing the actual merchandise until delivery. Ceramic storage vessels complemented wooden barrels, particularly for retail quantities and household storage. Large stoneware jugs transported smaller amounts from commercial establishments to homes, while specialized containers like costrals, flask-shaped vessels with carrying loops, allowed individuals to transport personal quantities. Glass bottles, though known throughout the period, remained relatively uncommon for everyday beverage storage until later centuries. Their fragility and expense limited their use primarily to valuable distilled products, medicines, and specialized wines intended for immediate consumption, rather than long-term storage or transportation. The transition from bulk storage to serving involved specialized equipment that enforced measurement standards and prevented theft. Tavern counters featured locked containers with measuring taps that allowed precise dispensing of regulated quantities, while ensuring that servers couldn't pocket payments for unrecorded drinks. The sensory experience of medieval drinking would be largely unrecognizable to modern consumers, accustomed to standardized, filtered, and stabilized beverages. Modern palates might initially reject many medieval drinks as flawed or spoiled, while medieval drinkers would likely find contemporary products unnaturally consistent and often insipidly mild. Medieval ale presented a cloudy appearance with visible sediment, a sweet, grain-forward flavor profile, and limited carbonation. Without hops as a preservative, these beverages developed sour notes within days of production, as lactobacillus and other microorganisms initiated spontaneous fermentation. Rather than considering this spoilage, medieval drinkers expected and accommodated these evolving flavor profiles. Wine quality varied dramatically based on production methods, storage conditions, and age. Without modern understanding of sterile technique or sulfite preservation, medieval wines were vulnerable to bacterial contamination and oxidation. Vintners developed various remediation techniques, including adding honey, herbs, or spices to mask deteriorating flavors in aging wines. The transition to hopped beer gradually changed flavor expectations, introducing bitterness as a desirable quality rather than a flaw. This shift represented one of the most significant sensory revolutions in medieval drinking culture. Though traditional unhopped ales maintained their cultural position in many regions despite the preservative advantages of hopped alternatives. Serving temperature affected sensory experience significantly. Without modern refrigeration, beverages were typically consumed at ambient or cellar temperature. Cooling options included submerging containers in cold streams or wells, storing in underground cellars, or adding ice or snow when seasonally available to the extremely wealthy. Adulteration and flavor enhancement through additives was common practice rather than deception. Herbs, spices, honey, fruits, and various plant materials might be added to mask flaws, extend supplies, or create distinctive local specialties. These practices existed along a continuum from necessary preservation techniques to luxury enhancements for elite consumption. As medieval towns grew, brewing evolved from domestic activity to commercial enterprise. Specialized brewers established permanent facilities capable of larger production volumes, gradually displacing household brewing in urban areas while complementing it in rural settings. The transition from feminine to masculine control represents a significant socioeconomic shift in medieval brewing. What began primarily as women's household work gradually transformed into a male-dominated commercial profession, particularly in urban centers. As brewing became more profitable and technologically complex, guilds and regulations increasingly excluded women from formal participation in the trade. Capital requirements for commercial brewing created economic barriers that concentrated production. Equipment costs, facility requirements, and raw material purchases demanded significant investment, allowing wealthy brewers to establish dominant market positions while forcing smaller producers to occupy specialized niches or exit the market entirely. Distribution networks connected production centers with consumers through both wholesale and retail channels. Specialized carriers transported barrels between producers and sellers, while various retail establishments, from dedicated taverns to general merchants, provided consumer access points. Taxation heavily impacted the economics of medieval alcohol. Production taxes, sales levies, import duties, and license fees created multiple revenue extraction points that significantly affected final prices. These tax structures often favored local production while penalizing imported alternatives through differential rates. Beyond its direct commercial value, alcohol frequently functioned as an alternative currency in medieval economic systems where coinage was scarce and barter common. Payment in kind often included ale or wine, particularly for casual labor, minor services, and community obligations. Church construction and maintenance projects sometimes funded themselves through church ales, brewing operations where parishioners contributed ingredients and labor, with proceeds from sales supporting building projects. These community enterprises created economic activity outside the standard commercial framework while directing resources toward communal goals. Rents and obligations might specify payment in alcoholic beverages rather than coin. Manorial records document requirements for tenants to provide specific quantities of ale or wine to landlords as part of their annual dues, creating standardized exchange values for these beverages within local economies. Hospitality obligations throughout medieval society created alcohol-centered economic transfers that reinforced social hierarchies. The expectation that lords would provide generous drink to retainers, guests, and occasionally the broader community represented significant wealth redistribution within a highly structured framework of mutual obligation. Black market activity flourished alongside legitimate alcohol commerce, with unlicensed production, tax evasion, and smuggling creating parallel economic channels. The significant price differentials created by taxation, regulation, and monopoly privileges made illicit alcohol trade profitable despite the risks of punishment. The production of alcoholic beverages connected diverse economic sectors through complex supply chains that extended from agricultural fields to consumers' cups. Grain producers, maltsters, brewers, coopers, transporters, and retailers all participated in interconnected networks that generated significant economic activity. Agricultural practices adapted to brewing and winemaking demands, with farmers selecting crop varieties and cultivation methods suited to these valuable markets. Particular barley strains known for superior malting qualities commanded premium prices, while vineyard management developed into a highly specialized agricultural niche. Urban-rural economic relationships intensified through alcohol production networks. Towns provided ready markets for rural grain production, while returning finished beverages to countryside consumers through distribution networks centered on market towns and trading hubs. Quality control mechanisms emerged to protect both consumers and the reputation of production regions. German beer purity regulations, early versions of the later Reinheitsgebot, French vineyard classification systems, and English ale tasting procedures all sought to maintain standards while creating market advantages for compliant producers. International trade networks developed around prestigious beverages, creating complex economic relationships across political boundaries. Bordeaux wines, distributed through English-controlled channels, represented some of the most valuable trade goods of the medieval period, influencing diplomatic relationships and commercial policies throughout Western Europe. Medieval legal systems developed extensive frameworks regulating alcohol production, sale, and consumption. These regulations balanced economic interests, public order concerns, and moral considerations while generating significant revenue through licensing and taxation. Urban ordinances typically specified permitted operating hours for drinking establishments, often requiring closure after curfew bells or before certain religious services. These time restrictions sought to limit disorder while ensuring that workers would be sober and available for morning labor. Quality regulations addressed both economic and public health concerns. Adulteration prohibitions targeted practices like diluting wine with water, mixing new wine with old, or adding harmful substances to mask spoilage. Standardized measures were enforced to ensure fair transactions, with official checking of cups and vessels a regular practice in many jurisdictions. Licensing systems controlled who could legally sell alcohol, often creating monopoly privileges that benefited established interests while generating municipal revenue. These systems frequently distinguished between different types of establishments: alehouses, taverns, and inns, with varying requirements and privileges for each category. Price controls appeared in many jurisdictions, particularly for everyday beverages considered necessities rather than luxuries. Maximum pricing for ordinary ale protected consumers while allowing premium products to command market-determined prices above the regulated threshold. Ecclesiastical authorities maintained complex and sometimes contradictory positions toward alcohol throughout the medieval period. While producing some of the finest beverages through monastic enterprises, the Church simultaneously condemned excess and regulated consumption through both moral teaching and direct legal authority. Ecclesiastical courts claimed jurisdiction over moral offenses, including public drunkenness and operating drinking establishments during prohibited times. Court records reveal regular fines imposed on individuals for these infractions, with penalties typically involving monetary payments rather than corporal punishment. Temperance rather than abstinence characterized mainstream medieval Christian teaching on alcohol. Following classical and biblical precedents, moderate consumption was considered compatible with virtuous life, while excess represented sinful indulgence. This balanced position contrasted with the more absolute prohibitions that would emerge in some later religious movements. Ritual and symbolic uses of alcohol in Christian practice created theological frameworks that inherently validated certain forms of consumption. The Eucharistic transformation of wine into Christ's blood, whether understood literally or symbolically, established sacred associations that complicated attempts to condemn alcohol entirely. Religious reform movements occasionally targeted drinking culture, particularly when associated with perceived moral corruption. John Wycliffe's Lollard movement in 14th century England, for instance, criticized tavern-haunting priests and the excesses of church-sponsored drinking festivals, connecting alcohol abuse to broader ecclesiastical failings. Beyond formal legal structures, medieval communities maintained social enforcement mechanisms that regulated public drunkenness and associated behaviors. Reputation and shame functioned as powerful controls in societies where economic and social survival depended on community standing. Local constables and watchmen bore primary responsibility for addressing public disorder resulting from excessive drinking. These officials, often drawn from the community rather than professional law enforcement, relied more on situational judgment and community standards than rigid application of written regulations. Gender standards applied differently to male and female drunkenness, with women facing harsher social penalties for public intoxication. A man's occasional excessive drinking might be tolerated or even celebrated as confirming masculine sociability, while similar behavior in women risked lasting damage to reputation and marriage prospects. Class distinctions significantly affected the treatment of public intoxication. Elite drunkenness received greater privacy and tolerance, with inebriated nobles or wealthy merchants more likely to be discreetly assisted home than subjected to public punishment. Conversely, working-class drunkenness faced greater scrutiny and more severe consequences, particularly when it interfered with labor obligations. The concept of the common drunkard emerged in legal and social discourse, identifying habitual excessive drinkers as community problems requiring intervention. These individuals might face escalating penalties, public shaming rituals, or ultimately exclusion from community resources if their behavior remained unreformed. Medieval drinking practices reflected and reinforced the rigid social stratification that characterized the era. Each social rank developed distinctive consumption patterns that signaled belonging while establishing boundaries against other groups. Aristocratic drinking emphasized rare, expensive beverages consumed from elaborate vessels during ritualized social occasions. Imported wines, spiced hippocras, wine infused with exotic spices, and aged meads demonstrated wealth through access to products unavailable to lower social ranks. Elaborate drinking rituals, formal toasts, ceremonial cupbearing, and precise etiquette further distinguished elite consumption from common practice. Merchant and professional classes occupied a middle ground, emulating aristocratic preferences when affordable, while developing their own distinctive practices. Guild feasts featured standardized drinking rituals that reinforced professional identity, with specialized ceremonial cups passing among members according to established precedents and procedure. Urban working classes developed tavern-centered drinking cultures that provided crucial social spaces outside the control of employers and authorities. For apprentices, journeymen, and laborers, the shared experience of tavern drinking created horizontal bonds that partially offset the vertical pressures of the hierarchical workplace. Rural peasants relied primarily on locally produced beverages consumed in domestic settings or village alehouses. Seasonal variations in consumption patterns tracked agricultural rhythms, with harvest celebrations and winter festivals permitting excess that would be impractical during planting and growing seasons. The poorest members of medieval society, vagrants, beggars, and the destitute, accessed alcohol primarily through charity, theft, or consumption of the lowest quality dregs. For these marginal populations, intoxication might offer temporary escape from harsh conditions, but also increased vulnerability to exploitation and violence. Gender significantly shaped medieval drinking experiences, creating different relationships to alcohol production, service, and consumption for men and women across social classes. These gendered patterns reflected broader social structures, while occasionally providing spaces for their negotiation or subversion. Women dominated early medieval brewing as brewsters or alewives, producing household beverages and selling excess production as an approved female income source. This economic role provided relative independence while remaining compatible with domestic responsibilities. The gradual masculinization of commercial brewing represented a significant economic loss for women as the medieval period progressed. Drinking establishments maintained complex gender boundaries, with respectable women's presence generally limited to specific contexts and conditions. Women might legitimately accompany husbands or family groups, particularly in rural settings or during daylight hours, while unaccompanied female patrons risked association with prostitution. Female tavern workers occupied vulnerable positions where service frequently blurred into sexual availability. Court records document numerous cases of harassment and assault against these women, whose economic necessity placed them in environments where their virtue was considered compromised by the mere fact of their employment. Elite women's drinking occurred primarily in domestic settings rather than public establishments, though with significant regional variations. While Northern European customs generally restricted aristocratic women's public drinking, Mediterranean traditions permitted greater female participation in wine culture, particularly within family contexts. Moral standards applied double standards to male and female intoxication throughout medieval society. Whereas male drunkenness might be tolerated as natural release from work pressures, female drunkenness typically faced harsh judgment as moral failure that threatened proper household management and sexual restraint. Age-related drinking patterns reflected medieval understanding of the human life cycle, with different beverages and consumption contexts considered appropriate for various life stages. These age-based customs integrated young people into adult society while accommodating the changing needs of aging bodies. Children in medieval society typically consumed weak ale or heavily watered wine as everyday beverages, reflecting both nutritional needs and water safety concerns. These diluted drinks provided calories and some hydration while containing minimal alcohol. Contrary to modern assumptions, medieval parents did not intentionally intoxicate children, though modern standards of complete abstinence for minors were absent. Adolescent drinking rituals marked important transitions toward adult status. Apprentices might receive their first full-strength drink at significant milestones in their training, while noble youths learned proper wine service and etiquette as part of their preparation for court life. These supervised introductions to adult drinking customs represented important socialization mechanisms. University students developed notoriously exuberant drinking cultures that authorities repeatedly but ineffectively attempted to control. From Paris to Oxford, student taverns provided spaces where young scholars celebrated their semi-independent status through consumption that frequently exceeded the moderation counseled by their professors. Mature adults were expected to demonstrate restraint that balanced appropriate sociability with responsible moderation. The ideal of the householder who enjoys convivial drinking without neglecting family obligations or work responsibilities appeared consistently in advice literature and moral instruction throughout the period. Elderly drinkers received both special accommodation and heightened scrutiny. Medieval medical advice often recommended wine for older individuals to warm aging bodies and stimulate failing appetites. Simultaneously, moral writers warned against elderly overindulgence as particularly undignified and dangerous for those nearing judgment. The connection between alcohol and violence represented one of the most problematic aspects of medieval drinking culture. Court records throughout Europe document countless alcohol-fueled confrontations, ranging from minor scuffles to homicide, with drinking establishments frequently serving as flashpoints for conflict. Weapon-carrying customs combined dangerously with intoxication in medieval society. Unlike modern contexts where specialized security might confiscate weapons at drinking establishments, medieval patrons routinely carried knives, daggers, and sometimes swords as everyday accessories. This practice meant that ordinary disputes could quickly escalate to armed confrontation when judgment was impaired by alcohol. Tavern games like dice frequently triggered disputes over alleged cheating, unpaid gambling debts, or simply poor sportsmanship exacerbated by drinking. Records from London's coroners' inquests reveal numerous cases where seemingly friendly gaming sessions transformed into deadly confrontations after hours of combined gambling and drinking. Factional and political tensions found expression through tavern violence, with drinking establishments sometimes serving as informal headquarters for rival groups. Urban conflicts between craft guilds, student nations at universities, or political factions often erupted in tavern settings where group identities were reinforced through shared drinking. Sexual violence associated with intoxication appears frequently in court records, with women in or near drinking establishments particularly vulnerable. Female servers, entertainers, and patrons faced harassment and assault from intoxicated men, with their presence in drinking environments sometimes used to blame victims rather than perpetrators. While lacking modern medical frameworks for understanding addiction, medieval society recognized and responded to patterns of habitual excessive drinking that disrupted individual lives and community functioning. These responses combined moral judgment with practical intervention strategies. The concept of the common drunkard in medieval law and social practice identified individuals whose alcohol consumption consistently created problems. These habitual excessive drinkers faced escalating community responses, from informal pressure to formal sanctions, including fines, public shaming, and eventually exclusion from normal social participation. Religious perspectives framed habitual drunkenness as sinful weakness requiring spiritual remedy. Confession, penance, and prayer were prescribed as treatments, sometimes complemented by periods of enforced abstinence or monitored consumption. Pilgrimage might be recommended as both punishment and potential cure for particularly severe cases. Family intervention played a crucial role in addressing medieval problem drinking. Court records reveal instances where wives, parents, or other family members sought official assistance in controlling relatives whose drinking threatened household stability through resource waste or violent behavior. Economic consequences often proved most effective in limiting excessive consumption. When drinking interfered with work obligations or depleted household resources, the resulting material hardship created practical incentives for moderation that complemented moral and social pressures. Medieval medical texts described hangover symptoms in remarkably familiar terms, while explaining them through humoral theory rather than modern biochemistry. The physical discomfort following excessive drinking was understood as the body attempting to restore balance, disrupted by alcohol's heating and drying effects. Remedial treatments for hangovers combined practical effectiveness with humoral theory. Recommendations included consuming cooling, moistening foods and drinks to counteract alcohol's heat and dryness. Advice that unknowingly addressed dehydration, a key component of hangover symptomatology. Broths, watered wine, and certain herbal preparations feature consistently in these remedies. Preventative measures suggested by medieval physicians included consumption of oil before drinking, creating a protective stomach lining, drinking in moderation, alternating alcoholic beverages with water, and avoiding mixing different types of drinks in a single session. These practical suggestions demonstrate observational effectiveness despite theoretical frameworks that differ from modern understanding. Long-term health consequences of excessive drinking received increasing attention from medieval medical writers as the period progressed. Liver ailments, digestive disorders, tremors, and memory problems were all associated with habitual heavy drinking, though without the systematic understanding of alcohol's physiological effects developed by modern medicine. Social and spiritual consequences concerned medieval authorities at least as much as physical effects. The damage to reputation, economic productivity, and spiritual well-being caused by habitual drunkenness featured prominently in both medical and moral writings, reflecting medieval integration of physical, social, and spiritual dimensions of health. Medieval drinking culture provides a revealing lens through which to view broader social structures and values. The production, distribution, regulation, and consumption of alcoholic beverages intersected with virtually every aspect of medieval life, from economic systems to religious practices, gender roles to class relationships. The tension between necessity and excess characterized medieval attitudes toward alcohol. As an essential component of diet and social functioning, alcoholic beverages received acceptance unimaginable in certain modern contexts. Simultaneously, the potential for excessive consumption to disrupt individual lives and community order generated significant anxiety and regulatory effort. Community over individualism emerged consistently in medieval approaches to drinking. While modern concerns about alcohol often focus on individual health impacts or personal addiction, Medieval regulation primarily addressed social consequences, how drinking affected household economies, work obligations, and community peace, rather than individual well-being in isolation. Pragmatism, rather than ideological purity, characterized most medieval approaches to alcohol regulation. Recognizing both beneficial and harmful aspects of drinking, authorities typically sought workable compromises rather than absolute solutions. This pragmatic approach acknowledged alcohol's deeply embedded role in social and economic life, while attempting to mitigate its most destructive manifestations. The integration of sacred and secular appeared consistently in medieval drinking culture, with religious and everyday consumption existing along a continuous spectrum rather than in separate spheres. This integration reflected broader medieval worldviews that perceived spiritual dimensions in ordinary activities rather than compartmentalizing religious and secular life. Contemporary drinking cultures, particularly in regions with European heritage, carry numerous legacies from medieval practices, often without conscious recognition of these historical connections. From regulatory frameworks to social rituals, medieval approaches to alcohol continue to shape modern experiences. Legal structures governing alcohol production and sales still reflect medieval precedents in many jurisdictions. Licensing systems, operating hour restrictions, quality regulations, and age limitations all have antecedents in medieval law, though adapted to modern contexts and concerns. Drinking establishments maintain continuities with their medieval predecessors, despite dramatic changes in physical environment and social context. The public house or pub, particularly in Britain, represents direct institutional descent from medieval predecessors, while taverns, inns, and alehouses have modern equivalents serving similar social functions. Ceremonial drinking rituals with medieval origins persist in contemporary practice, from formal toasts at significant celebrations to specialized drinking songs and games. These ritualized practices continue to transform ordinary consumption into socially meaningful events that mark important occasions and reinforce group identity. Regional specialties with medieval roots remain important cultural markers and economic assets. Traditional brewing regions, wine appellations, and distinctive local beverages often trace their development to medieval production centers, with some modern producers explicitly emphasizing these historical connections in their marketing. The study of medieval intoxication offers more than colorful anecdotes about our ancestors' drinking habits. It provides a valuable perspective on how societies integrate potentially problematic pleasures into functioning social systems, a challenge that remains relevant despite changed circumstances and scientific advances. The medieval balance between regulation and accommodation offers instructive contrast to both prohibitionist impulses and laissez-faire approaches in modern alcohol policy. Medieval pragmatism acknowledged both legitimate pleasure and potential harm without demonizing either the substance or its consumers. The communal emphasis of medieval drinking culture suggests alternative frameworks to highly individualized modern approaches to alcohol problems. While respecting individual autonomy remains important, reconnecting drinking to its social contexts and responsibilities may offer complementary strategies for addressing contemporary challenges. Historical perspective reminds us that humans have been negotiating relationships with intoxicating substances throughout recorded history, developing cultural practices that maximize benefits while containing harms. This long view encourages humility about any single era's approach, while affirming the possibility of constructive adaptation rather than either unrestricted access or futile prohibition. Perhaps most significantly, medieval drinking culture reminds us that intoxication has never existed in isolation, but always within complex webs of meaning, relationship, and purpose. The medieval drinker consumed not merely alcohol, but participation in community, momentary transcendence of difficult conditions, celebration of significant moments, and connection to traditions that provided continuity and belonging in an uncertain world. In raising our own glasses, we might recognize our connection to those long-ago drinkers who, despite the vast differences in their material circumstances and conceptual frameworks, sought through their cups many of the same fundamental human experiences we continue to pursue in our own times and ways. Imagine yourself pushing open the heavy wooden door of a 14th century London tavern on a winter evening. The rush of warmth, light, and noise contrasts sharply with the dark, cold street you leave behind. Tallow candles and a central hearth provide uneven illumination, casting long shadows across the crowded room while filling the air with a distinctive smoky scent that mingles with the smells of spilled ale, unwashed bodies, and whatever might be cooking in the pot hung over the fire. The earthen floor beneath your feet has been strewn with rushes, perhaps mixed with herbs like meadowsweet to provide some pleasant fragrance, though by this hour they've been thoroughly trampled and soaked with various spills. You make your way to a rough-hewn bench at one of the trestle tables, careful not to disturb the dice game underway at one end or the intense conversation between a merchant and what appears to be a ship's captain at the other. The tavern keeper's wife approaches, wiping her hands on her apron. "Ale or wine?" she asks, eyeing you to assess your likely status and ability to pay. When you request ale, she nods toward a serving girl who soon returns with a wooden cup filled with a cloudy amber liquid. The ale is room temperature, somewhat sweet with a slight sourness around the edges. Nothing like the clear, carbonated beverages that would later take its name. It's opaque with suspended yeast and grain particles, and there's a hint of the herbs used to flavor it before hops became common. Around you, the tavern's regular clientele represents a cross-section of urban medieval society. A group of apprentices celebrates one of their number completing his training, their boisterous singing growing louder with each round. A few craftsmen still wearing their guild badges discuss business matters over cups of better quality wine than your ale. In the corner, a friar shares a bench with two women whose clothing and manner suggest they aren't there solely for the beverages. As the evening progresses, a man with a lute begins playing, and some patrons join in with familiar songs. Stories are exchanged, some believable, others clearly enhanced with each telling. News travels from table to table. A new tax has been announced. A merchant ship has been lost at sea. The price of grain is rising again. The tavern functions as a newspaper, entertainment venue, business meeting place, and community center, all rolled into one. Arguments break out occasionally, over politics, religion, the dice game in the corner, but most resolve themselves without serious incident. The tavern keeper keeps order with practiced efficiency, knowing his license depends on preventing serious disorder. When two men rise with hands moving toward belt knives, his imposing presence between them and reminder of the night watch patrolling just outside quickly cools the situation. As curfew approaches, the tavern begins to empty. Those with homes nearby settle their tabs and depart, while travelers staying above stairs finish their last drinks. You drain your cup, leave your payment on the table, and step back into the now quiet street, carrying with you a centuries-old experience of communal drinking that, for all its differences, would still be recognizable to anyone who has ever sought conversation, comfort, and connection over shared cups. In this imagined medieval tavern, as in countless real ones that served their communities throughout the Middle Ages, Alcohol was never merely a beverage, but a medium through which human beings constructed meaningful social worlds. A tradition that, despite all the changes in how and what we drink, continues unbroken into our own time.